What happens when Hollywood's most beloved, reformed bad boy walks into what should have been a routine late-night interview, only to discover the host has prepared an ambush that will destroy years of carefully rebuilt reputation? In just 33 seconds, one calculated question would transform Seth Meyers from respected comedian into the most hated man in entertainment, while Mark Wahlberg's explosive response would remind everyone why you should never corner a fighter from Boston. The Late Night with Seth Meyers studio felt different that Tuesday evening. The usual energy backstage carried an unusual tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Mark Wahlberg sat in the guest chair, adjusting his jacket and nodding politely as the makeup artist applied final touches. He had done this routine hundreds of times before. Talk shows were easy. Plug the movie, share a funny story, shake hands, go home. Seth Meyers paced behind the cameras, his usual pre-show nerves replaced by something more calculated. His producers had spent weeks preparing for this interview, digging deeper than usual, finding angles that other hosts had been too polite or too scared to explore. Tonight would be different. Tonight would make headlines. The red light flickered on. Seth straightened his tie and walked to his desk with that familiar late-night host swagger, the practiced smile that had carried him through years of safe, predictable comedy. The studio audience applauded as he settled into his chair, completely unaware they were about to witness television history. Welcome back to Late Night. I'm Seth Meyers, and joining me now is actor and producer Mark Wahlberg. More applause as Mark walked out, waving to the crowd with genuine warmth. He had that natural charisma that made audiences love him, the kind of authentic connection that couldn't be faked or manufactured. Seth stood and shook Mark's hand, but something felt off about the gesture. Too firm, too long, like he was trying to establish dominance before the real fight began. "Mark, great to have you here," Seth said as they both took their seats. His tone was pleasant enough, but Mark's years on Boston streets had taught him to read people. Something was coming. "Thanks for having me, Seth. Always good to be here." Mark's response was genuine, relaxed. He had no idea what was waiting for him. "So, you've got this new action movie coming out. Another one of those Mark Wahlberg saves the world type films." Seth's first question seemed innocent enough. Standard promotional territory. "Yeah, it's called Horizon Point. Really excited about it. Great cast, incredible stunts, and the story really connects with people who understand what it means to fight for your family." Mark leaned forward slightly, warming up to his favorite topic. Seth nodded along, but his eyes held that calculating look that experienced guests learned to recognize. "Right, fighting for family. That's always been your brand, hasn't it? The tough guy from Boston who turned his life around. I mean, I wouldn't call it a brand. It's just who I am. Where I come from shaped me, and I try to use that in my work." Mark's voice carried that slight Boston accent that made him sound more authentic than most Hollywood actors. "Where you come from?" Seth repeated the phrase slowly, like he was tasting it. "Let's talk about that for a minute." The studio audience shifted slightly. Something in Seth's tone had changed, become sharper. Mark felt it too, his posture straightening just a fraction. In the control room, producers leaned forward in their chairs. "You've built this whole image around being this reformed bad boy, right? The guy who made mistakes but learned from them and became better." Seth's smile never wavered, but his words carried an edge now. "I think that's a fair description, yeah. I'm not proud of everything I did when I was young, but I've worked hard to become a better person." Mark's response was measured, careful. He could sense where this might be heading. "A better person?" Seth nodded thoughtfully. "That's interesting phrasing, because when I think about becoming a better person, I think about making amends for past mistakes. Really making things right." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Mark's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a reaction that only someone who knew what to look for would notice. Seth knew exactly what to look for. "I've done my best to make amends where I could," Mark said quietly. "Have you, though?" Seth leaned back in his chair, completely comfortable now that he had found his target. "Because I've been doing some research, Mark, and I found some really interesting stories about your past." Mark's hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, slowly formed fists. Not obvious enough for the cameras to catch clearly, but Seth saw it. The predator had found weakness in his prey. "We all have stories from our past, Seth. The important thing is learning from them and growing." Mark's voice remained steady, but everyone in that studio could feel the change in atmosphere. "Oh, I agree completely. Growth is so important. But I'm curious about something specific." Seth reached down beside his desk and pulled out a folder, thick with papers. "I've got some police reports here from your teenage years. Really fascinating reading." The audience was dead silent now. This had gone far beyond typical late-night banter. In the control room, someone whispered about cutting to commercial, but the producer held up a hand. This was television gold. Mark stared at the folder in Seth's hands. His breathing had changed, becoming deeper, more controlled. Anyone who knew him well would recognize the signs. Mark Wahlberg was getting angry. "You know what I find most interesting about these reports, Mark?" Seth continued, his voice taking on that fake concern that talk show hosts use when they're about to deliver a killing blow. "It's the details. Really specific, disturbing details about the things you did to innocent people." "Seth." Mark's voice carried a warning now, low and dangerous. "I think we should move on to talking about the movie." But Seth was past the point of no return. He had spent too much time preparing for this moment, had invested too much in this ambush to back down now. He opened the folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. "This is particularly interesting. A police report from 1988. You were 16 years old and you attacked a Vietnamese man outside a convenience store, hit him with a stick, and called him some really ugly names." Seth looked up from the paper, his expression a mask of manufactured sympathy. "The man was blinded in one eye, Mark, permanently disabled because of what you did." The studio went completely silent. Even the cameras seemed to stop moving. Mark sat perfectly still, his face a stone mask, but his eyes blazed with a fury that made everyone in that room suddenly aware they were in the presence of genuine danger. "You want to talk about that, Seth?" Mark's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the silent studio like a gunshot. "You really want to go there?" Seth's confidence faltered for just a moment. He had expected denials, maybe some stammering, perhaps a quick pivot to damage control. He hadn't expected this quiet, controlled fury, but he was too far committed to stop now. "I think it's important for people to understand who they're supporting when they buy movie tickets," Seth said, trying to regain his theatrical composure. "This isn't ancient history, Mark. This is assault. This is a hate crime. And from what I can see here, you never properly made amends to your victim." Mark slowly stood up from his chair. Not aggressive, not threatening, just rising with the deliberate control of someone who had learned to channel rage into something more powerful. The studio audience collectively held their breath. "Sit down, Mark, we're having a conversation here." Seth's voice cracked slightly. For the first time since this ambush began, he looked genuinely nervous. "No, Seth, we're done having a conversation." Mark's Boston accent became more pronounced when he was angry, and right now it was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You want to talk about my past? You want to dig up things I've spent 30 years trying to make, right? Let's talk about that." Mark took a step closer to Seth's desk. Not close enough to be threatening, but close enough that Seth had to crane his neck to look up at him. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. "I was a stupid, angry kid from a broken neighborhood. I made terrible mistakes. Mistakes that hurt innocent people. You think I don't know that? You think I don't carry that with me every single day?" Mark's voice was rising now, not shouting, but building with genuine emotion. Seth tried to interrupt. "Mark, I'm just trying to." "No, you're not trying to do anything except make yourself look important by tearing me down." Mark pointed directly at Seth, and the host physically recoiled. "You sit behind this desk every night making jokes about people, pretending you're some kind of moral authority. But what have you ever actually done? What have you ever sacrificed? What have you ever built?" The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible. Seth's producers were frantically signaling from the control room, but he was frozen, caught completely off guard by Mark's response. "I've spent 3 decades trying to make up for the stupid things I did as a kid," Mark continued, his voice now carrying the weight of real pain. "I've worked with community organizations. I've mentored kids from tough neighborhoods. I've donated millions of dollars to victim advocacy groups, not because some publicist told me to, but because I needed to do something with the guilt I carry." Seth attempted to regain control. "But you never reached out to your actual victim. How do you know what I've done?" Mark's question hit like a physical blow. "How do you know who I've talked to, who I've apologized to, what private conversations I've had? You've got some police reports from 30 years ago and you think that tells the whole story?" For the first time, Seth looked genuinely uncertain. His research team had been thorough about the public record, but they hadn't investigated private attempts at reconciliation. The possibility that there might be more to the story hadn't occurred to him. Mark sensed the weakness and pressed forward. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Seth? When I hurt people, I was a stupid 16-year-old kid who didn't know any better. You're a grown man who just ambushed me on national television for entertainment." The audience began to murmur. What had started as shock was transforming into something else. They were beginning to see Seth as the aggressor here, and Mark as someone who was being unfairly attacked. "I'm a talk show host, Mark. It's my job to ask tough questions." Seth's defense sounded weak even to him. "Tough questions?" Mark laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This isn't journalism, Seth. This is a hit job. You brought me here under false pretenses, pretended this was going to be about my movie, and then tried to destroy me for ratings." Seth tried to rally. "I think people deserve to know." "People deserve to know what? That I made mistakes when I was a teenager? That's not news, Seth. I've talked about that in interviews for years. I wrote about it in my book. The difference is, when I talk about it, I talk about growth and redemption and trying to be better. When you talk about it, you just want to watch someone burn." Mark moved around to the side of Seth's desk now, not threatening, but clearly in complete control of the situation. Seth had to swivel in his chair to face him, making the host look small and defensive. "You want to know what making amends really looks like?" Mark's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper again. "It looks like admitting you were wrong. It looks like taking responsibility. It looks like doing the work to be better, even when nobody's watching, even when there's no cameras, no audience, no credit for it." The studio audience was completely with Mark now. What had started as an ambush had transformed into something much more powerful. They were watching a man defend not just himself, but the very possibility of redemption and growth. But you wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Seth? Because you've never had to fight for anything. You've never had to claw your way out of a bad situation. You've never had to look at yourself in the mirror and admit that you're the problem. Mark's words were surgical now, cutting straight to the heart of Seth's privilege and self-righteousness. Seth's face was flushed red. He had completely lost control of his own show, and worse, he was beginning to realize that the audience, his audience, was turning against him. "I don't think personal attacks are." Seth began weakly. "Personal attacks?" Mark's voice exploded across the studio. "You just spent 10 minutes reading my police record on television, and you want to talk about personal attacks? You ambushed me, Seth. You lied to me. You brought me here under false pretenses to humiliate me for your entertainment, and now you want to play victim?" The control room was in complete chaos. Producers were screaming contradictory instructions, but nobody knew how to handle what was happening on stage. This had gone so far beyond standard damage control that there was no playbook for it. Mark looked directly into the main camera, bypassing Seth completely. "You know what? I'm glad this happened, because now everyone gets to see exactly who Seth Meyers really is. Not the friendly comedian you see every night, but someone who will destroy a person's reputation for ratings. Someone who thinks other people's pain is just material for jokes." Seth made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Mark, I think you're overreacting." But Mark was done with Seth completely. He turned back to face the host one final time, and when he spoke, his voice carried 30 years of hard-won wisdom and genuine authority. "No, Seth, I'm reacting exactly right, and so is everyone watching this." Mark pulled off his microphone and dropped it on Seth's desk with a decisive thud that echoed through the stunned studio. The small wireless pack followed, landing with a sharp crack that made Seth flinch visibly. This wasn't just someone leaving an interview. This was a complete rejection of everything Seth represented. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Seth?" Mark's voice carried across the silent studio as he gathered himself to leave. "I actually respected you. I thought you were one of the good ones. Someone who used comedy to bring people together instead of tearing them apart." Seth tried one more time to salvage something from the wreckage of his ambush. "Mark, if you would just sit back down, we can have a real conversation about." "A real conversation?" Mark turned back, his expression a mixture of disgust and pity. "You had your chance for a real conversation. Instead, you chose to be a vulture. You chose to dig up the worst moments of a 16-year-old kid's life and parade them around for laughs." The studio audience was completely captivated now. They had come expecting standard late-night entertainment and instead were witnessing something raw and genuine. Many were pulling out their phones, already recording what they knew would become legendary television. "I've got news for you, Seth. That 16-year-old kid you're so obsessed with, he grew up. He became a man who takes responsibility for his actions. He became someone who uses his platform to help people instead of hurting them. Something you clearly never learned how to do." Seth's face had gone from red to pale. The magnitude of his miscalculation was becoming clear not just to him, but to everyone watching. What was supposed to be his moment of journalistic triumph had become his complete humiliation. "But here's what really gets me," Mark continued, his voice building again. You sit here every night making jokes about politicians and celebrities, acting like you're some kind of moral authority. But when it comes time to show some actual morality, some basic human decency, you fail completely." Mark gestured toward the audience, many of whom were nodding along with his words. These people came here to be entertained, to laugh, to forget about their problems for a while. Instead, you turned them into accomplices to an ambush. You made them watch you try to destroy someone for sport. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of Seth's growing discomfort. His usual quick wit had completely abandoned him. All his prepared comebacks and deflections seemed inadequate in the face of Mark's raw honesty. "You want to talk about making amends, Seth? Start with them." Mark pointed directly at the studio audience. "Apologize to these people for wasting their time with your personal vendetta. Apologize for turning what should have been fun into something ugly and mean-spirited." Seth looked out at his audience, many of whom were staring back at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright hostility. The loyal fans who attended his tapings religiously were seeing their host in a completely new light, and they didn't like what they saw. "I was trying to hold you accountable," Seth said weakly, his voice barely carrying beyond the first few rows. "Accountable to who?" Mark's question cut through Seth's excuse like a blade. "To you? What gives you the right to be anyone's judge and jury? What qualifies you to decide who deserves redemption and who doesn't?" Mark walked closer to the audience now, speaking directly to them instead of to Seth. "This man brought me here tonight under false pretenses, told my people it would be a standard promotional interview. Instead, he planned an ambush designed to humiliate me and destroy my reputation. Is that the kind of person you want representing you?" The audience's response was immediate and clear. A wave of supportive applause began building, starting small but quickly growing into sustained approval. They weren't just clapping for Mark, they were rejecting what Seth had tried to do. Seth watched his own audience turn against him in real time. The people who had come to support his show were now actively cheering for his guest to humiliate him further. It was a host's worst nightmare, and it was happening live on television. "You know what real accountability looks like?" Mark addressed both Seth and the audience. "It looks like admitting when you're wrong. It looks like apologizing when you hurt people. It looks like doing better next time." Mark turned back to Seth one final time. "But you can't do any of that, can you? Because that would require admitting that you made a mistake. That would require showing some actual vulnerability instead of hiding behind your desk and your jokes and your fake moral superiority." The control room had given up trying to manage the situation. They were just letting it play out, knowing that cutting away now would only make things worse. This was live television at its most unpredictable and powerful. "I came here tonight to talk about a movie that I'm proud of. A movie about people who fight for what's right, who protect the people they care about, who stand up to bullies." Mark's voice carried across the studio with absolute authority. Instead, I got ambushed by someone who apparently never learned the difference between holding people accountable and just being cruel. Seth made one last desperate attempt to regain some dignity. "Mark, I think if you look at this objectively." "Objectively?" Mark's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Objectively, you're a talk show host who just destroyed his own credibility on live television. Objectively, you took someone who came here in good faith and tried to humiliate them for ratings. Objectively, you showed everyone exactly who you really are when the cameras are rolling." Mark looked around the studio one more time, taking in the cameras, the audience, the crew members who were all staring in stunned silence. "And you know what the really sad part is? Tomorrow morning, you'll probably try to spin this as some kind of victory. You'll tell yourself that you were just doing your job, that you were being a tough interviewer, that I overreacted." Mark shook his head slowly, genuinely disappointed rather than just angry now. "But everyone who watched this tonight will know the truth. They'll know that when you had the chance to show some class, some basic human decency, you chose to be petty and cruel instead." The studio audience erupted in applause again, this time even louder and more sustained. They were witnessing something extraordinary, a complete reversal of power, a moment where the guest had not just defended himself, but had exposed the host character completely. Seth sat frozen behind his desk, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. Everything he had planned for this interview had backfired spectacularly. Instead of destroying Mark Wahlberg's reputation, he had destroyed his own. Mark walked toward the exit, then paused and turned back one final time. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, carrying the weight of someone who had learned hard lessons and earned the right to speak them. "I hope someday you figure out the difference between entertainment and cruelty, Seth. I hope you learn that real strength isn't about tearing other people down, And I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for that makes you think hurting people is acceptable. With that, Mark Wahlberg walked off the Late Night with Seth Meyers stage, leaving behind a host whose credibility lay in ruins and an audience that would never forget what they had just witnessed. The cameras kept rolling as Seth sat alone at his desk, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making, finally understanding the difference between an interview and an execution.